Last time we have still been discussing we finished discussing some of the religious climate of Jesus' day. And we got into a little bit of the dating of when was Jesus born, when did his ministry start and end, that sort of thing. We talked a little bit about how we keep track of time and how AD, remember what AD stands for? We have BC and AD. BC before Christ. AD is...
Domini?
Yes, Anno Domini, which means...
In the year of our Lord.
In the year of our Lord. Good job, you guys are passing the pop quizzes. I like it. And we also explained that timing system was developed hundreds of years after Christ. So there was the question of when exactly Easter was, and people wanted to celebrate Easter at approximately the right time. And we see through the 6th to 8th centuries, we had a couple of monks who, one in particular, Dionysius Exiguus, and that would have been in the 400 to 500 AD era. He developed this system initially. He was an Eastern Roman monk, and then a couple hundred years later there was Bede, known as Bede the Venerable, and he was an English monk, and he actually popularized what Exiguus had developed. And so we see post that most of the world use it, at least in the Christian sense, has used BC and AD. We looked at a few scriptures to talk about when exactly Jesus was born, because again, this system of telling time BC, AD, it wasn't exact. It was very, very close. Exiguus, I think, did an exemplary job for what he had back in those days. Previously, they could only really tell time by whoever was in power of a certain country or an empire, and you would just look at the years that each ruler ruled. And so to have something that was consistent throughout hundreds of years, based on what he had to work with, he came very, very close. But we discovered that the BC AD system does not have there is no 0 AD. It just goes 1 BC to 1 AD. And you would think, well, when was Jesus actually born? The idea is that, originally it should be around that 1, but it wasn't exactly. And does anybody remember where we were kind of landing last time? 4 to 5 BC, that's correct. So a few scriptures, and you can write them down if you didn't last time. We're not going to read them again this time. Luke chapter 3 and verse 23, we can see that Jesus' ministry began at about 30 years of age. So he was about 30 years old when he started his ministry. We see in John chapter 2 verse 20 that the temple had been 46 years in the building by the time he started his ministry. We know that Herod the Great, that began rebuilding that second temple around 20 to 19 BC. So you take 20 to 19 BC, add 46 years to it, and you're at about 26 to 27 AD when Christ began his ministry. So Luke 3:23, John 2:20. And then we can further corroborate this with Luke chapter 3 verse 1, where Luke records that John the Baptist's ministry. Now John the Baptist would have been just a short time before Jesus began his ministry, but not very much earlier. That John the Baptist's ministry began in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. And we discussed how Tiberius Caesar jointly ruled with Augustus Caesar beginning in AD 11. 11 plus 15, now you're back again to the AD 26 to 27. So basically, to summarize, Jesus was probably born around 4 to 5 BC. The beginning of his public ministry was probably around 26 to 27 AD. And then his crucifixion, of course, would have then be approximately 30 AD. We didn't really discuss how we get to 30 AD yet, though, did we? So, does anybody have an idea how long Christ's public ministry did last?
3.5 years.
Okay, 3.5 years. Some believe it's 2 to 3 years. Some think it's 3 to 4 years. I would say, based on what I've read, most scholars are leaning towards that 3 to 4 or 3.5. Why? Why is that? There are Passovers. There are several Passovers mentioned in John. We're not going to look at each one, but write these down if you're taking notes. John chapter 2, verse 13. John chapter 6, verse 4. And John chapter 13, verse 1. So we know that there are 3 Passovers mentioned here by John. There is, however, another feast that is mentioned in John chapter 5, verse 1. And it has been debated whether or not this was a Passover feast or a different kind of feast. Most of the scholars seem to think that chapter 5, verse 1 is most likely a Passover feast. And so that's how they get the 3.5 years, the 3 to 4 years of ministry. You would have had the very first one on the year that he initiated, followed by several more, which would equal about 3 to 3.5 years or so of actual ministry.
Take on,
Last,
because it's the Passover, just for someone who might not know, it was once a year.
Yes.
So just, to make that more clear, so that's how you're getting the years.
I'm getting the years because the Passover happened once per year. And you had one that happened right about the time that Christ started, followed by 3 more. So you start at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 Passovers. Does that make sense?
Herod wanted the infants died, killed.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment. So a comment came up last week about Herod, and one of the point I was trying to make last week in determining the approximate time of Christ's birth is the fact that Herod was still alive when after Christ was born. And we know that Herod died in 4 BC. So that's a historical fact. So as a result of that, there was a comment about the children that the wise men who had come, or the magi, as some versions have. So let's take a moment throughout this class, and we'll go to Matthew chapter 2. And in particular, the verse that is going to trigger this conversation is chapter 2, verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, now, not literally mocked, we'll talk about that in a minute, was exceeding wroth. And he sent forth and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Previously in the chapter, the wise men had seen a star. They traveled from the east. These magi or wise men were most likely astrologers. They would have lived in Persia, which was hundreds of miles away, potentially. One source even said they could have lived as far as 500 miles away, perhaps. They would most likely have traveled by camel, and this was a thing that the Magi in the Persian area would have done. They would go around and welcome new kings, and so this star appeared to them, and it led them to Jerusalem. And I'm not going to read all of Matthew chapter 2, but Matthew chapter 2 covers all of this. And so when they got to Jerusalem, of course, they ran into Herod, and they're like, hey, we want to go worship this king. And Herod, being the unsavory, vile beast that he is, and I'm using strong words because I really do think so, and I'll tell you why in a moment. The Herods have a reputation to start with, but this particular Herod, Herod the Great, was particularly unsavory. And Herod inquired of them of the time that the star appeared. And he also asked the Magi, he said, go find this child, find which one it is, so that I may worship him. Well, that was deceit. That was an evil scheme on Herod's behalf. He had no intention of worshiping the child. He wanted to kill the child. Why? Herod, being the person he was, let's talk about him a little bit. He had, and this is an opinion, he had a tie to the power that he had as a king. He did not want to lose that power. And if anybody appeared as if they had power to challenge him, he did away with them. And it included his own family. For example, I mentioned his favorite wife, Mariamne. He killed Mariamne's grandfather. Her grandfather was about 80 years old when he killed him. And this grandfather had previously saved Herod's life. So think about someone who has saved your life. Maybe you've been in a situation where someone has saved your life. Do you think you could ever turn around just for this attachment to power that you do not want to lose out of jealous rage and your own security?
His insecurity. Yeah.
Well,
that was his biggest problem.
He was also, I think, paranoid. I think
I
there was mental illness that went along with this, but again, that's pure speculation. But the fact of the matter is, he killed his wife's grandfather who had once saved his life. So just put yourself in the shoes of if someone had saved your life and had never done anything to really appear like they wanted to usurp you or take your power away, and for some reason you decide to kill them. What reason would you have? That's not the only person he killed. He killed Mariamne, his wife, too. Publicly executed her. Supposedly his favorite wife. So it tells you what he thinks of women. The mother, too. Mariamne's mother was also executed not too long after.
When?
He killed 3 of his sons.
What did
Yes.
those women do to be killed? I don't remember the story.
You know, the records, I don't have a reason why he killed them, but I can tell you that there was one son, one of his own sons, he killed at the age of 18 just because the people appeared to have favor toward him. Wow. So it's a jealous rage where, oh, somebody else has got favor and it's not me, and oh, they might usurp my power and take my throne. He wasn't functioning correctly. He killed 3 of his own sons.
Seems like Satan really...
Killing your own children. Think about that. Just because you're afraid that you're going to lose power or whatever reason. He had a couple of them strangled. After he had them imprisoned, he ordered them to be strangled. And from what I could read in the record, there was no particular foundable reason why. It wasn't, he just did that.
Why did they call him Herod the Great?
Yeah.
What was so great about him?
He demanded it or you die.
Or you die.
That's essentially it. Upon his deathbed, now he died a horrific death. Josephus believed it was God's punishment upon him prior to hell for his sins. But upon his deathbed, he had ordered, I think it was in the area of Jericho, he had ordered all the chief scribes and priests to come, and they had to come because if they didn't come at his order, they would be killed. Well, he had them hold up, and he knew the Jewish people, and he told He sent orders that upon his last breath that they be slaughtered, that they be killed. He knew the Jewish people would delight in his death. He knew his subjects well. But he didn't want them delighting in his death. He wanted them to mourn. And so that was a spiteful move for him to ensure that they were sad at his death by killing their own leaders upon his last breath. Even Augustus Caesar, Roman emperor at the time, his boss, said it would be better to be a pig than to be his own son. So this is the Herod that we're talking about. So when we read in Matthew chapter 2 about him killing all of these children that were 2 years old and under, this is pretty much incompatible with his character. This is the kind of thing Herod would do. How many children might that be? Some people estimate that Bethlehem was in the order of maybe 1,000 to 2,000 people at that time. It's just an estimate. I don't have an exact number. But based on that estimate, they also estimate that children that were 2 and under, that were males, infants basically, they would have probably been anywhere from maybe 10 to 30 children. So keep that in mind. That's probably around the order of magnitude of what we're looking at for how many children actually died. When it says he was mocked, there's other versions out there. It says in verse 16, then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked, does anybody else have something different than the word mocked?
Tricked.
Tricked.
Outwitted.
Outwitted. So what actually happened, remember, after the wise men worshiped Jesus, God warned them in a dream that they should not return to Herod. And so they went back to their country another way. You see that in verse 12. So they weren't really deceiving. God came to them in a dream and basically told them, go home, don't go back to Herod. So you can only imagine what might have happened if they did, right? God is protecting providentially, and in this case, God coming directly to them in a dream, that's more miraculous. But he's protecting Jesus. He's ensuring his survival. And then, of course, the angel came to them and had them flee for Egypt because Herod, in his wrath, I mean, this is a madman's fury is what it is. I'm going to get that child no matter what. So if I can't get the one singular child, he only intended to kill one. He only intended to kill the one, Christ. But because he couldn't get that, he said, I'm just going to kill them all. Kill all the children, and I'm going to make sure I get them all. So it says, all children 2 and under. We don't know exactly how old Jesus was at this time. We know it probably took at least 1 to 2 months to travel for the wise men from Persia. They would have probably had to prepare for the journey too. This is not a light journey to make, so there would have probably been some time to prepare for the journey. So maybe a few months minimum, possibly. We're just throwing out approximates here. We don't know exactly. But we do know, and previously in the chapter, that he inquired. In verse 7, he called the wise men, inquired of them diligently or exactly what time the star appeared. So Herod had an idea of when that star appeared. He had an idea about the time he thinks that Jesus was born. But if you're a paranoid madman that had just been outwitted, so to speak, and you're going to make sure you get them all, you might give a little bit of buffer, just to make sure. That's supposition. Again, there are some scholars that seem to think that he could have been just over a year old, anywhere from 6 months to just over a year old. The way that they might have counted years back then, if you were, say, 1 year and 3 months old, today we would say 1 year and 3 months. But since he was 3 months into his second year, you might say he was 2. So we don't know the exact age of Jesus. Now, we do see in verse 11, when the Magi had come to the house, they saw the young child. That's what my version has. Anybody else have anything else in verse 11? I have young child. Some might just have child. Young child. Okay. In the Greek, it does mean literally young child, and it also means infant. So we're definitely looking at a very young person. Again, it's not telling us that Jesus was 8 months old or 1 year and 3 months old. We don't know exactly. But if you just follow the logic of this brute and beast of a person, Herod, he probably gave a little bit of buffer just to ensure he got the child. So just keep that in mind. We don't actually know how old, whether it was closer to 6 months or if it was actually closer to a full 2 years as we would think of it today. But rest assured, he was definitely under 2 years old. What about that star? Sometimes people will bring this up. This star came to, they came to these wise men, they followed it, potentially hundreds of miles, and then after getting to Jerusalem, they followed it again and found Jesus in Bethlehem. Some people have thought that maybe it was a couple of planets. I've heard of Jupiter and Saturn kind of coming close together from our vantage point in the sky, and it appears by the naked eye as one star. And so I think the last time that happened was actually in 2020. And then by the naked eye, Jupiter and Saturn would have kind of come close and looking like a brighter star. So some have supposed that there is some natural astrological reason, or that they saw a star that led them to Jesus. Some have thought that maybe it's a comet or something because it was moving and maybe led them there. Halley's Comet would have probably been last seen around 11 to 12 BC, not 4 to 5 BC when Jesus was born. So we're pretty sure it's not Halley's Comet. Let's take a little bit closer look at the star itself. So they had followed this star, and Herod is telling them, go to Bethlehem, find the child. Let's take a look in verse 9. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star, which they saw in the east, went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. So the star appeared to them in Persia, in the east. They followed it a really long way. They meet up with Herod. They depart Jerusalem to go for Bethlehem, and this star appears again and leads them. First of all, the star is singular. Aster, singular. It is not the merging of multiple planets that appear as stars. It's singular. Secondly, it led them. It led them to the place where Jesus was, even to the house. This is not a comet. It is not something that you can explain by observing the stars in the sky today. I would put forward that this is more of a miraculous type of star that was sent for that one purpose of locating Jesus. But you will hear other stories like I have just mentioned. So keep that in mind as well. There was something else I think I wanted to talk about, but I think if anyone does anybody have any questions about that or any comments?
Yeah, I think it's pretty significant. It says the star appeared in the east.
Mm-hmm.
And if it moved, it would have been a move from east to west.
Yep.
And maybe even south, if it appeared in Jerusalem and then moved it downwards to Bethlehem. So astronomically, that's kind of, would be interesting to a lot of people.
How is that star going to move in the sky? You can't make zigzags. Yeah, in verse 2 it says, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him." His star. And in verse 9, it stood over where the young child was. That's in verse 9. And in verse 10 it says, "And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house," based on verses 9 through 11, it would appear that the star led them exactly to Jesus. It didn't just rest over Bethlehem, it brought them to the house. So this is significant. This is miraculous type of thing. And it's not out of context from what you might see. Remember in the wilderness of Sinai, for example, there was a light that led by night through the wilderness. And, of course, the cloud by day.
Well, the Lord did that throughout. He said he
Yep.
prepared a fish to swallow Jonah. It wasn't just something that was there.
Right.
He had prepared it. So he does that whenever he needs to.
There are a number of examples where light is used. Remember Moses' face shined with light. Remember the light at the Transfiguration. There are several other examples of light. So to see a star that was this light that led them straight to Jesus is certainly not outside the realm or anything singular to what God would use, which he has used light throughout the Bible to help guide people. And
Anyway, it's kind of interesting though that, to me, I mean, but why other people didn't really notice that star. You know, just like me, if I was back in that time, would I have noticed it? Would I have? But they were astrologists, so they were always looking.
they were learned men. So the Magi were learned men. This is something they paid close attention to.
Right.
So it's I couldn't suppose or guess if it was necessarily seen by others, but we do know that it had a very express purpose.
I know.
And
That's what's
which
cool
was
about it.
accomplished.
Yeah.
And that it was not, I personally don't think it can be explained away by the stars that we see in the night sky today, or comets, or etc.
Just curiosity back on the timeline. However many, 100 or 200 miles, however far the wise men, however many there were of them, how long would it have taken them to reach Jesus? That could be factored into the timeline.
One source says it could have been as far as 500 miles, and it could have taken as long as 2 months to travel.
Yeah.
So it was not a light journey to make. So we know that some time had passed since his birth by the time the Magi
Right.
reached
It's not like
him.
we see in the normal manger scenes where
Right.
they're standing over an infant, newborn infant.
It's not a newborn infant scene. It's not newborn. Still, possibly still an infant, because the word in the Greek for young child can mean infant. But obviously, it's likely that some months had passed, and that's probably explains why Herod in his effort to make sure he got the child, killed every male child 2 and under.
But he had to have some kind of a timeline himself, because in 7 it says the exact time the star appeared.
Oh, he inquired of them. He was
So
going
he-
based on what they told him and what he thought he knew.
Lynn,
Yeah.
if Herod thought he was outwitted, so that means he must have known what was going on, outwitted. He saw something that,
Well, when the Magi didn't come back to him.
well, to kill
Yeah.
the children. To kill all 2 and under, he realized he was outwitted.
And
So
so,
then in his anger,
Yep.
so he wasn't looking for Christ, the child, at that point, right?
his every intention, his sole purpose was to kill Christ.
But if it showed that he was outwitted, that means he must have known that he didn't succeed. So now he got mad and decided to just kill all the 2 and under boys. Is
Well,
that-
he still hoped to have success.
Okay.
So by doing that, it's interesting, when you start sinning, you might think you only have an intention to do a little bit of sin, but then when things don't go your way, especially with people like Herod, it tends to grow.
Okay.
And so he still intended to kill the Christ. Yes, he did it in anger, but he also did it in an effort to secure his own security, to secure his own position, and to ensure that the Christ died. He didn't know that the angel came to them and told them to flee to
Telling all the
Egypt.
wise men to
And
go
then,
back.
and get this, after Herod died, his terrible death, they were informed, you can come back now.
Yeah.
Oh,
So Herod really didn't know.
okay.
And I won't go into the details of his gory death, but it was terrible, and Josephus felt that he deserved it. Yes, Jeff?
You know, we always go on, 2 years and younger. But he was outwitted by the Magi, and he may have been thinking, maybe they told me wrong. I mean, he could have been just a year old.
Could have been.
And he just figured, hey, they outwitted me this time, I'm just going to outwit them, and I'm going to add another year, just to make sure.
And that would be in the line of a maniacal tyrant.
Exactly.
That would be the way a maniacal tyrant would think,
I mean, he could have been 9 months old, but he was going to add another year.
just to make sure.
Just to make sure that I'm going to get him no matter what. They're not going to outwit me again.
He knew that they were there to worship and to bring, to worship Jesus. So he knew that they were there for a reason. He had inquired as the time that the star appeared. So he did have an idea. Yes, Joe?
So going back though to like Andrew's sermon, he was talking about who are we fighting against? Not flesh and blood, right?
Mhm.
So we have to look at Herod, what was motivating Herod?
Power.
And it could have been Satan behind him. And that's what Andrew was talking about last week.
If you are not for me, you are against me. He certainly was not for Christ.
Andrew was saying, people are motivated by the dark forces, basically, but they still have a soul. But it sounds like Herod had gone so far that he was consumed by it.
Even on his deathbed, as he drew his last breath, he was ordering executions out of spite. That's a hard heart.
Yeah.
So, yes, Herod was evil.
Satan was over Herod, is what I'm getting.
And so to summarize, we don't know exactly how old Jesus was when Herod slaughtered the male infants. However, we do know that he was born in that era of about 4 to 5 BC, started his ministry around 26 to 27 AD, and was crucified around 30 AD. I've got one more minute. We've spent a lot of time trying to figure out dates and times, etc. I want to tell you something. Christ's kingdom is eternal. Before we had the BC AD system, remember we mentioned a lot of times they would use the years that rulers were in power to keep track of time. In the 15th year of Tiberius, for example, in Luke chapter 3, verse 1, that was a typical historical way to tell time. One of the reasons we refer to Luke as a historian, because he writes like a historian. I want to emphasize the fact that it really doesn't matter which year Christ was born, because his kingdom is forever. It is still in effect today. It is timeless. So it's great study to do. It's great to kind of have a very close idea, and we know we're probably in the ballpark here. Just remember, Christ's kingdom lasts forever. It's still in effect now. Why would it matter that his exact year of birth? That only plays into a factor if you care about the physical, and Christ has always been centered on the spiritual. So with that, my time is up. Thank you for your attention.